the emphasis on certain kinds of issues, environment, gender, gay rights, of course, now the transgender business, the notion of, feminism, all those ideologies. If the oligarchs are perfectly happy with that agenda.
Yeah.
What they don't want to deal with is the class and income inequality. That's where they have a big problem. And, I don't know how they're going to be able to deal with that.
Without the class analysis, I think the point that you made, how many of these things oligarchs can live with, that's always a bad sign. If the progressive critique can be incorporated and serve the interests of that extreme.
Well, it's going to be, and then of course the ultimate thing that they're looking at is just having, everybody will get a check from Mark Zuckerberg so they can live in their little apartment and play video games all day and maybe occasionally drive for Uber until it gets automated.
Right. Yeah. Well,
that's quite a vision of life.
No, that's right. That's the the spectre of uselessness and the way that universal basic income kind of massages that by not making everyone destitute, but just making them nearly destitute. Welcome to part 3 of CaliBunga, Tech, Drugs and Capitalist Soul. This is Alpha Bunga Bunga's multipart series on the Californian Ideology. 2/3 of the podcast, that is George Hoare and myself, Alex Hochuli, were in California in May 2019, thanks to the School of Humanities at the University of California, Irvine, to record sessions with the States of Wellness Research Group, who are critiquing the ideology of wellness today. As was hinted at in parts 1 and 2, wellness in part functions as a way of blaming people for their failures to be healthy, which relates quite closely to an increasingly rigid class structure.
What's really happened is that the doors to a kind of stable social mobility narrative arc that was one of the great promises of the American post-World War II period has completely shut for the most worthy members of aspiring, like working and middle class kids. But when you think about how it's an infrastructural door that's shut, that shutting of the door is internalized within each of you as a kind of personal failure, just as, illness now or mood disorders or depression is internalized as a personal problem that needs to be solved and managed. This is what produces and keeps reproducing in the publishing industry, both academic and popular, this narrative that the system is just and that those who make it are simply better than those who don't, and that we don't care about those who don't. That is the ideology of austerity.
Catherine Liu there, convener of the States of Wellness Group, and our very gracious host while we were in California. In this episode, we're going to move from the Californian ideology to exploring more of the Californian reality. This is both to discuss the material shifts that have given birth to some of the Californian ideas we've already discussed, as well as the social consequences of putting Californian ideology into practice, especially in terms of mobility and the built environment. Some of what you'll hear will not fit with the standard left-wing narrative on cars and suburbs, for instance. In a way, what we're doing is shedding a critical light on the social and economic liberalism of Californian ideology by referring to its opposite, a more culturally conservative and economically statist, even social democratic politics. In a way, this is what came before, between 1945 and 1973, which can in some ways be seen as the original golden age of the Golden State. It was in that period, driven by industries such as aeronautics, that California was made great. Our current period, from the 1990s until today, is driven by information technology, and its boosters claim that it's another era of Californian greatness. But that greatness is obviously very one-sided, to say the least. Its social and especially psychic costs have been explored at length in parts 1 and 2 of CaliBunga. Here we're going to talk a little bit more about the social costs. So first you're going to hear us talking to Joel Kotkin, fellow in urban studies at Chapman University in Orange, California. Most relevantly to what you'll hear here is the new class conflict and the pamphlet Californian Feudalism, the squeeze on the middle class. Here's Joel on the idea of California.
Well, California is sort of like the second America. It developed well in advance of most of the West. As Theodore Roosevelt said, it was west of the West. And it really became kind of a parallel society because the initial settlement after the gold rush, or started by the gold rush, was essentially people who came, in the most part, came around South America. So you had people coming from all sorts of parts of the world, obviously also from China. And so the settlement pattern is not as predictable as you have in the rest of the United States, where people start in the east and they start moving west. It's kind of like you sort of teleport yourself into this completely different environment. And of course, California was also unique in the obvious natural relationship with Asia. It had been a Spanish and Mexican place, so it didn't have the British heritage that had shaped so much of American culture. It didn't have nearly as strong a Germanic influence. The United States is really sort of historically a blending of the Germanic and the English. That's really where the culture comes from. Sort of English political institutions and German efficiency is kind of the combination, I think. But fundamentally, what California represented was a new start. That's why people came here. They didn't like where they were. They didn't, whether they were coming from abroad or from the rest of the country. Actually, up until the 1950s and 60s, LA in particular was not a big immigrant town. It was actually a very small percentage of the people were born outside the country. That changed obviously very dramatically.
And then I guess, especially after the Second World War, which in a way ends up being a real boon to the United States as a whole, certainly relative to other important powers at the time.
Right.
California in particular becomes quite important then and becomes a bit of a boom area, right? It becomes a destination and for inward migration. So, I guess, is there something that distinguishes what one might call the Californian dream from a broader American dream? Is it a subset of it? In that maybe perhaps speaking specifically in that time of like the 1950s.
Well, what California was it was certainly an extension of the American dream, but it brought with it characteristics that were not necessarily the typical. One obviously is the link to Asia, and that whole influence is just a completely different thing. You can't understand California's evolution without understanding the importance of the Asians. Not only in trade, but in horticulture, in gardening, in what things were planted here. If it was up to the Anglos, they were still growing wheat in the Central Valley. It was the Chinese and the Japanese and later the Indians who said, oh, well, actually it's a really good place to grow, whether almonds, apricots, pears, and obviously the Japanese were particularly very important in coastal California in developing the fruits and vegetables. So that I think is a major difference. Another one is if you moved from Boston to Detroit, you might have done it for economic reasons, but you certainly didn't go for the climate. California had an aspect of paradise that did not exist elsewhere. Florida is sort of a second-rate California, but it's hot and humid, and the bugs are bigger than people. It's not. Yes, Florida and to some extent Texas, where I do a lot of work, are sort of second versions of California in some senses, but no place had the physical and climatic conditions of California. So that added to it. And then during World War II, you were mentioning that, you had the tremendous aerospace boom, and of course, very good place to test airplanes. You had the fact that the outside of Seattle, the big ports were both, San Francisco and LA were here, and obviously the Navy was in San Diego. And a really important point was that because California offered something physically different and almost exotic, it attracted all sorts of people. particularly you think about all the German and Hungarians who came. Kevin Starr tells a great story about there was a party in Hollywood, and Otto Preminger was one of the big producers, and he found people speaking Hungarian. He said, "Don't speak Hungarian. This is California. Speak German." So we have, even I'm old enough to remember that old Hollywood and the last remnants of that German, Hungarian, Austro-Hungarian kind of culture that in many ways came here. So many people came here. Aldous Huxley came here. Thomas Mann came here. So you don't have that. You don't have those kind of people emigrating to Detroit or Denver. They came to California because California was promised, as Kevin, who's unfortunately not with us anymore, what Kevin talked about, there was something special, something magical. When I moved to California, first I lived in the Bay Area, and you fly in and you look up and you see San Francisco and you see the Bay, or you fly into LA and you see the mountains, particularly this year with the snow. There's nothing like it. There's something special, and then you add the light. I mean, if you're European, you know what the climate's like. I mean, it's so you can see why, like David Hockney, his stuff. Why there are so many British people here, so many French people here. There was something materially different than the rest of America.
So you talked about this aspect of paradise. Do you think this still holds today? So to bring this forward,
Sure.
a lot of your work is about the current state of California.
Well, the lovely thing about California, and I'm, again, old enough to remember, everybody you met was from somewhere else, and none of them were going to leave. It was a place where if you were, a machinist from Mexico, or a boat person, or a working class guy from the Midwest, you could come to California and you could create this life. And that was what was so great. It was a dream that was not an exclusive dream. The change of the last 20, 30 years, it's become an exclusive dream. To live the California lifestyle today requires enormous amounts of money.
Yeah, I mean, even that kind of the idea that the average American could have in California, that lifestyle which involved home ownership and a certain upward mobility, at least a realistic possibility of it, even if it wasn't achievable for actually the majority. But I mean, it still did. There was still a funnel which operated, right?
It was, and now you can see it in the statistics. Like we now have an average or even below average percentage of people who were born somewhere else. I mean, that was dramatically different. Whereas places like Texas and Florida continue to attract people from other places. To some extent, Seattle has some of that as well. So the idea of it being a kind of egalitarian dream has been replaced by a much more, I would argue, feudal dream, where if you don't have inherited money, if you don't have look, if you have a PhD from MIT, you've got a reasonably good chance that you're going to be able to make it in California. But if you have a bachelor's degree from the University of Alabama, probably not. So the nature of that dream has changed, and we now have a group of people in this state who, basically they don't believe in home ownership. They don't believe that people should have backyards. I mean, the whole notion of coming to California, to me, to come to California and live in a dense apartment is like, why? If I'm going to live that way, I'm going to go live in Paris, I'm going to live in London, I'm going to live in New York, I'm going to live in Chicago, cities that were built that way. And, you get compensation, like I'm a New Yorker, as you can tell from my accent. Okay, I'm going to live in a small place in New York, but I walk out the door and I'm in New York.
Yeah.
And I can take the subway, and I can take the cab, and I can walk to 50 different restaurants. That doesn't exist in California.
Which is something that we notice. I mean, us kind of growing up in Europe, kind of feel very viscerally almost that you're in LA and yet you're not really sure where exactly you are. And that for people who haven't grown up with that, it's an odd sensation. So I mean, maybe you could tell us maybe a little bit more in detail about the hardening of class divisions in California and what have been the drivers of that? I mean, obviously you talk about housing specifically as a main factor.
Well, one of the big drivers is, in a funny way, reflecting the sort of Californian ideology, which is this extreme focus on sort of wellness and quality of life. But it turns out that the price of that, the way it's interpreted, so for instance, we're saying we're not going to build suburbs. We're not going to build on the periphery. We're going to force everybody to live in the inner city, where to live nicely in the inner city is extraordinarily expensive. And I think that what's happened is our policies, for instance, I'll give you an example. California has an enormous amount of oil. This place is built on oil, okay? It was one of the big drivers of particularly Southern California's emergence around the turn of the century. That's Getty, Occidental Petroleum in Bakersfield. There was lots of different examples. We now have a policy where we essentially are trying to kill our energy industry. Now, we're still using oil. We're just getting it from Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, maybe they think that's a more progressive regime. But, so fundamentally, we've created an economy where our electricity prices are well above the national average. If you notice, the gas prices are considerably
for us they're cheap, but okay.
But they're really
go to the UK. That's expensive petrol.
Yeah, but UK is postage stamp compared to
of course.
And of course a lot of it's relative. So we've driven the price of housing. Our price of housing relative to income was about the same as the rest of the country until the 70s, and then we started to impose all these sort of basically, I would say almost millenarian ideas of. I don't know if you read the book Ecotopia.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, and I knew Colin Bach because he was a friend of my cousin in Berkeley, and it was this very sort of we're going to live a separate reality from the rest of the country, and so instead of becoming sort of an expression of the American dream, in some ways we became a kind of counter-American dream. It's almost like California has decided to live in opposition to the rest of the country and to have a different model. Now, that model, it works very well if you owned property before 1990. It works very well if you're a tech oligarch. It works very well if you're, you've got a comfy position in a university or something like that. But for people coming in, almost impossible. And the chances of upward mobility are really low. Our rate of growth of immigrants is now about a third of what it is in Texas. And look, people don't go to Texas for the weather. They don't go for the topography. They go for the opportunity. California used to have opportunity in paradise. Now you have to have opportunity in second choices and third choices. I mean, Seattle is beautiful, but of course it's wet 9 months a year. So, if you don't want to tempt yourself to commit suicide.
So I guess there's a question here around. So you talk about the great middle class squeeze. So the people who didn't fit into those categories that you talked about, of owning property before 1990, very comfy position, or tech oligarch. How did people who might previously have had quite high expectations? How did they respond to these changes?
Well, I think there are a lot of things happening. A lot of people left.
Okay.
We look at who's leaving California. It's not the old folks. That which is sort of the image, the old and the stupid. That's what the story is. Actually, what we're finding is it's people in their 30s, particularly people with kids. That's where the big out-migration is taking place now.
Where are they going particularly?
There seem to be different flows. The more working class and more Southern California tends to go to Nevada, Texas, and Arizona. The more upper class and more Bay Area tend to go to Oregon and Washington and Colorado. And those people can go to either, but again, I look at it as, I'm fortunate that I came to California in 1971 and was able to get into the housing market. When I tell people that I bought my first house in Hollywood for $150,000, they fall off their chairs. I'm sure that house is worth, 10 times that now. So I think that what we've got is a dream that's becoming increasingly elusive for the vast majority.
Yeah.
And then there's something particularly disturbing when you're in a place that is so clearly filled with all sorts of utopian possibilities, and you end up with dystopia. It's quite difficult.
One aspect of dystopia, or something that could presage a form of dystopia, is this idea of cutting off, of becoming separate. And so you mentioned California as this idea of somewhere kind of outside, but in a more positive light. And now you have a development of something which I guess you can cast more negatively, and you do cast more negatively, which is Silicon Valley and what you call kind of this new oligarchy. We might come on to discuss a little bit more the feudal metaphor that
right.
you use. I want to ask you actually if it is a metaphor, but we'll come on to that.
Yeah.
Maybe if you could describe this development of Silicon Valley, because you also mentioned aerospace earlier, the aerospace industry being very important. In the 50s, it's a precursor to the development of the tech sector
right,
in that area of California today, but it's quite different in many ways.
I covered Silicon Valley starting in 1975. It was a very different place. First of all, it was amazingly egalitarian. There were lots of opportunities for people, manufacturing. There was a lot of, so you had like PC board places. You had places like Intel, Hewlett-Packard, which were very good employers, a lot of middle managers. People moved to Silicon Valley because they could buy a single family house, where there used to be an apricot orchard. It was very much more like the San Fernando Valley. It was very similar. And then what's happened in the last 20 years is it moved away from industry more and more towards software. As my friend Leslie Parks, used to be economic development director for San Jose, said, we used to make things, then we used to design things to be made, and now we think about them. I mean, that, other words, so at every level, the opportunities for anyone but the very super cognitively gifted have declined. And so you have tremendous levels of population that has very marginal existence. You read about people who live in their vans and work at Google.
So you talk about the Brave New Valley,
right?
So could you this idea that you have real splitting into these different groups following Huxley? Can you tell us a little bit about?
I'm a big Huxley fan. So basically, what you have is you have a kind of an alpha group at the very top, and the alpha pluses at the very top of the very top, and then there's kind of this group, the betas, who are sort of basically making it, but are living much less well than they would somewhere else. And then you go down to this vast population, this vast underclass of people, many of whom have to live 50 to 100 miles away and commute in. And it's, and there doesn't seem to be any way that you break into that. First of all, there's no unions, so there's no way to increase the wages of people, except in this kind of very dog-eat-dog way. That's where you get this weird combination of sort of utopianism and unbelievable class divides at the same time. And of course, it has a medieval ring to it, in the sense that medieval societies were run by theology and California is run by ideology.
Except you have this other ingredient of this sort of hyper-individualism as well. I mean, that's what frames the competitive aspect as well, in which maybe even draws from, as we maybe want to come on to talk about a little in a little bit, but from notions of New Age or even of cultural liberalism, which feed into ideas of individualism, which seem very important to contemporary California.
They are, but there's a really interesting thing that's happened with that individualism, which is it's morphed increasingly into orthodoxy and become increasingly authoritarian. And California is developing into a very authoritarian place where I'll give you, if you want to do things, there are so many things you can't do anymore. Or the idea that you would be able to have a house and water your garden. They're putting taxes on water. They're putting so many different restrictions on power. And, as this ecotopian ideology becomes stronger, the class divides will become greater because, you think about, you get rid of single-family homes. Well, what are the gardeners going to do? Families can't be here. It's become very family unfriendly as well. San Francisco being the epitome.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally on board with this idea. I'm under no illusion that individualism necessarily runs contrary to authoritarianism. I mean, certainly in certain cases, and we've discussed actually many episodes on this podcast about the ways in which kind of defensive liberal individualism and the market often have recourse to quite authoritarian means. And maybe we could talk about that already. I don't know if we want to move on to this already, but in your book on class, on the new class structure in America, I mean, you use this medieval metaphor, or feudal metaphor really, where the new clerisy takes an important place, and that's the media industry, academia, the federal government as well, which, I mean, I guess maybe to put a question in a more pointed fashion, do you see that new clerisy as providing legitimation for the oligarch or the rule of oligarchs?
For sure. I mean, and of course there are going to be interesting contradictions, which obviously somebody like me who was trained in Marxism probably would see pretty clearly, even though I'm certainly not a Marxist. But for instance, if you see the emphasis on certain kinds of issues, environment, gender, gay rights, of course now the transgender business, the notion of feminism, all those ideologies, if the oligarchs are perfectly happy with that agenda.
Yeah.
What they don't want to deal with is the class and income inequality. That's where they have a big problem. And I don't know how they're going to be able to deal with that. For instance, you have them wanting to basically wipe out single-family homes and putting in all these places. Well, where's their workforce going to come from? Where 30-somethings with kids don't want to live in little apartments. How are they going to deal with the issue of, it's really interesting, the contradiction between their worldview and the economic reality that people live? I mean, are they making life better? Is life better in Silicon Valley than it was 20 years ago? I think most people who grew up there would not agree that it is. And particularly young people, because if you're an old person, you bought your home, at least you made a fortune on your home.
So it's millennials getting really squeezed out.
Right.
So if this is one side of it, the new clerisy and the legitimation, what are the so you're right, in a way not seen since the land consolidation of the Middle Ages when lords established military control, or perhaps since the early days of the Industrial Revolution, the shift to a digital economy has created an enormous accumulation of wealth. So this is obviously the other side of this feudal, or this, when you talk about feudalism. So could you maybe tell us a bit about how has this happened, and what's been the role of the state perhaps in this?
Well, I mean, I think that the state initially obviously was a great driver of upward mobility. From the freeway systems, the water systems, the power systems, the university systems, all the various state colleges. Over the years, the state has not invested in that physical infrastructure and has allowed the California education system to deteriorate enormously. So whereas, let's say, the person who moved to California from New Jersey in 1970 was able to go into a good school system, now they're, in many cases, unless they have a lot of money, they're going to a crappy school system that is not very well run and doesn't show any particular movement to getting any better. You look at the University of California. University of California was built as a school for Californians. Now a huge percentage of the students are from overseas, paying full freight, and the school feels less and less like a school of California, and so that linkage between the state and its middle class and working class has just deteriorated over time. We've chased businesses out of the state. We have the energy prices, the housing prices. And so what you've got is a small group of people who have done extraordinarily well, and most everybody else has done worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the contradictions of financialization, which is
Exactly.
across the globe, are played out in very stark form in California. I mean, you can almost have a little microcosm of the world, or maybe the West, I guess, rather than the whole world in California. So, I mean, you talk also about the degree, what is about 25% poverty rate, and particularly the Central Valley, which is particularly some very poor areas of the country.
Well, if you take a look at the United Way study, which I thought was the best one, it's called The Real Measure. And they looked at, and basically about 30% of the population is a paycheck away from being pretty destitute. We have very high levels of debt. Even the middle class has a very high level, because of, if nothing else, just housing. And then we have a very high tax regime. California, for many years, had kind of a middling tax regime. Now we have one of the highest tax regimes. And that's very difficult if you're a young family and, you're spending, you have a tax just from the state of 10 to 12%, and you add that to the federal, you're at about 50.
But I mean, is the argument that then that falls too heavily on the middle class or kind of average incomes rather than on higher earners?
Yes. And of course, it's on the higher incomes. And then a lot of things are financed by sales taxes, which
is regressive.
Yeah, but completely regressive. If you have a tax on water, or probably the best example is the energy prices, as a result of, sort of the messianic green policies of California, energy is incredibly expensive. Well, frankly, I use a tank of gas a month. Okay, I ride my bike to school. My favorite days, you don't even start the car, and I live 8-minute drive from the school. If I'm a working class guy in Riverside who has to drive a truck because he's a construction worker, he's taking an F-150 from Riverside to Long Beach every day, that price makes a big difference. For me, maybe it's, sushi less, one less sushi meal during the month. For that person, it could be a game changer. We did a study. This was really interesting. Here at Chapman, we published a study in which we looked at, would a union construction worker be able to buy a medium price house in coastal California? Not one could buy it.
It sounds like a bit of an updated version of nickel and dimed Barbara Ehrenreich study. Like what can you achieve given the sort of pay
But
regime?
the difference is she was dealing with the very low end service workers. You're talking about skilled trades in the union making really good salaries, and who in most of the country would be very solid middle class people, and have historically in California been solid middle class people. Now they're forced to live 50 to 100 miles away.
We'll be back for more with Joel Kotkin in just a bit. But first, let's turn to what was distinctive about Californian development, and especially the urban environment of LA, and also discuss the possibilities and limitations of Silicon Valley-driven tech solutions. We met up with a friend of the podcast, Tim Abrahams, in a bar in an open-air mall in Irvine, California, as you do. Tim is a writer on architecture and urbanism for The Economist and Architectural Record, and is a contributing editor to design magazine Icon. He was visiting California at the same time we were, on a Winston Churchill Memorial Travel Grant to study contemporary and post-war suburban housing. So here's us talking to Tim over some beers.
There's a book called The Four Ecologies of Los Angeles, written by a British writer called Raina Bannon in the 1960s, which is this kind of, it's important from Los Angeles perspective because it's
crayon there if anybody wants it.
Thanks, man. I'm more of a blue crayon kind of guy. It's written by a kind of architecture critic, but also someone who's writing about a city. And for the first time, someone says what Los Angeles is future. It's incredibly important. It confounds every single thing kind of planning theory that's been produced by left-wing intellectuals since the beginning of modernism to now. Everyone rejects it.
So how does it run against left-wing theory about urbanism up till then?
Density is key. Density is key. Public transit is key.
And this just blows this out of the water. It goes, no,
doesn't
LA
blow it
is...
out of water because what it does is it's a kind of slow elegy to the place. It's not a kind of like, you guys have got it all fucking wrong. It's a kind of it breaks Los Angeles down into 4 zones. The seaside towns, the kind of elitist hilltops, and it calls it the plains of id, which are basically it's the flatlands in which we are a kind of now an external element of. And
id, like a Freudian id.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of a kind of, and then also fourth is he calls it utopia, which is the driving experience. And the Plains of Id is really interesting because he understands. He basically explains that the great kind of idea about Los Angeles is that you can do what you want when you know. That's what's the logic to it? Well, the logic is to it. Get in the car and you go where the fuck you want to. And he kind of.
But that reaches like its end now. I mean, if you're stuck in traffic, just take the example of mobility, right?
Yeah.
If you're stuck in traffic, that kind of freedom isn't there, really, right? I mean,
I think. Well, one, I think it's a price to pay.
okay.
You know, the traffic is bad. It's the thing that binds Los Angeles in many ways, complaining about the traffic. Actually, the traffic is, it's worse than it was. But I spoke to quite a few people here, and they're saying, well, the problem was happening in Los Angeles, and it relates to the earlier point about them introducing this Brooklynization. They changed the planning system to encourage employment within different hubs, like Culver City's become a kind of tech center. It's where Amazon Studios are. It's the kind of combination between the tech and the film industry. So you have these new centers where employment exists in one of these kind of random cities around the place.
Wow, really good.
Yeah, great.
Wow.
Actually, Los Angeles is becoming less mobile. People are staying in their little areas much more than they did in the 60s and 70s, where it was like a kind of I live here but I work there, whereas now it's like I live and work here. And you hear people saying it's like it's ruining Los Angeles, this kind of constant. I mean, the traffic is part of that, but the population of Los Angeles is pretty static. It's not like it's kind of booming. It's like areas out here where they are.
Yeah, they're building a fair bit, but
but then they're not. These people aren't working in Los Angeles. These people aren't. They're working in.
Catherine was saying there's a fair bit of commuting though, like people who live in Orange County and
there is, but it's polycentric. It's not from here to the center. It's like people here might be going to to Hollywood. Some might be going to East Los Angeles. Some might be going to downtown. Very few will be going downtown. So you have a kind of. But then you have this kind of contraction of the possibility. And there are huge things that need to happen with the transit here, and that is what's the interesting thing, the exciting thing of the new technology. If you're going to have, you actually read in the 4 ecologies of Los Angeles, Rena Banham saying, what you have to do is when you're driving is just become man-machine. You just kind of take over and you become machine. And he says it's very easy to think, now this is in 64, it's very easy to imagine the time when these things will become actually robotic and we'll be sitting in them and they'll be traveling. And this is the point, this will be Los Angeles in 10 years, and it's now happening, it's going to happen. Whether it happens in a way which aids public transit or whether it's a way that aids the .com companies is the interesting thing.
Because it's quite striking. You have these, I think we're in the I-401, right, and multi-lane highway, but actually so much time lost by people just changing lanes in a very inefficient, irrational way. Because it's actually quite a potentially massive arterial road.
And and automated cars would then be able to would reduce that.
Well, it's
because there's an element of collective intelligence, so the cars know where they're.
I mean, it looks as if kind of high-level autonomy. There's a kind of, I think it's created by Stanford or was it MIT, a kind of 5 levels of autonomy. And the idea of the 5th level of autonomy is just like you sit there and fucking it does everything, you know. And the idea at number 3 is that it's kind of taking hold of certain functions, and you kind of think, well, how do you progress up this chart of autonomy? And actually, a lot of people say, well, number 5 is probably never going to happen. And the shift at the moment is to concentrating less on the vehicle, but on the systems which govern the vehicle. So you have 5G. One of the reasons why 5G mobile phone technology is important is because it's about cars being able to talk to infrastructure. So infrastructure, so that there can be a system of signaling which says, in this area you will go 50 miles an hour, and you will go 50 miles an hour because we're in control of your fucking car. You know, so there's there's a kind of left turn, and you know, San Francisco's up there, these companies are up there, and the big problem, the big test case is Los Angeles. And the mayor of Beverly Hills was saying, I want to put it out to anyone who wants to listen, to any AV company, come to Beverly Hills and let's do something. Let's do something with public transit. Let's do something about it. And whether they come to do something about public transit or whether they come to do something about how Waymo can be in charge of the traffic system, and they still keep selling cars. You know, they're incredibly skeptical. Anyone in a public position here is, you know, I said to them, isn't it interesting that it's the .com companies who are kind of trying to solve problems of suburban development? And they said, these guys don't give a shit. These guys don't care at all. They're just trying to make money. You know, you have people talking very positively about the idea of autonomous vehicles, but what you then, you know, and you go, well, you know, that's great because they're coming up with this stuff, and you can have a chat, and they're like, these guys are out to make as much money from us as possible. These guys, the reason why Waymo, you know, I spoke to a guy called Matthew Coolidge at the Center for Land Use Interpretation. He's very positive about the idea of autonomous vehicles, but then you're going to go, oh, great, you can talk to these guys that are making that. And he was like, those guys are assholes. Those guys are, you know, and there's a definite sense that there's a big struggle between...
An antagonistic relationship.
Between, and what is surprising here, you kind of think because you've got this utterly diffused urban settlements and you have these very distinct mayoral bodies that they're actually going to be quite weak. These guys are kind of, like the mayor of Beverly Hills was like, pretty strongly I'm a communitarian, he says. I don't know what the fuck a communitarian is, but he's like...
Blue Labour.
I don't know. But he was like, we want to make... These guys have it, we want to make it work for our city. Yeah. Let's talk about it, but it has to be for us. Yeah. And that makes you know, the thing that's interesting from a kind of from a high-tech point of view, from these tech people point of view, is that they're like, oh shit, it's not happening now. It's going to take 10 years before anything happens. And like, that's a lifetime in tech, you know. That's
right.
Like, how many different iPhones will happen in those 10
But I mean,
years?
they're going to make their profits, right? I mean, it seems that there's such laxity from regulatory authorities, from cities, from municipalities, with regard to any sort of tech incursion into the areas of transport and mobility, that like, you could regulate them and make it work for us, as the mayor of of Beverly Hills put it. I mean, they'd still be making money. They're just not going to be making money hand over fist and kind of.
I don't think so. I think that there is a gap between what the urban possibilities. There's a gap that exists between the technical potential of what autonomous vehicles can do, say in a kind of a random lot. University campuses is where the shuttles are being tried out because you know, it can move, it's got a closed loop, it can move around, it moves at slow speeds. There's a huge gap between that and the citywide being in a real world, and actually there's a gap of expertise between translating that to that, and that expertise is about it's about transport planning. It's not about a technical solution, which is what the .commers have come up with.
Yeah.
And that requires an extreme level of negotiation because there's a huge lot of ideological fix and focus within that transport kind of planning scenario. I.e., some people are just like, you're just cars, we don't want you, you're just a fancy car and we're against cars. Or it's a case of, we represent our democratically elected officials and we want to make this work for the widest number of possible people. Or it might be, how much money can you give me? I don't give a shit, let's get going.
I guess it's hardly surprising that the tech approach is solutionist. Like, let's just solve this as a purely technical problem without any social, political,
social engagement.
Context.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting. That's true. That's very true. But there is a sense that these guys grew out the suburbs of San Francisco, Palo Alto, Mountain View. These are suburban areas. They created dense employment areas, which created a problem of car transport. They looked out the windows of their offices and saw huge queues to get into their car parks. And what they did was try to come up with a technical solution to that. And there's an absolute fundamental. This is the key thing I keep saying to people here, and they're like, "Shut the fuck up! They don't care. They just want their money." Yeah, okay, that may be true, but the technical fix is about dealing with congestion, and there is a logic to that, and that logic will ultimately, I think, have a beneficial effect on being able to provide public transit here, and from here in other cities around the world. There's a great book about Los Angeles called Holy Land by a guy called DJ Waldy, who was the head of the communications guy for a local city called Lakewood, which was built in the 1950s, and it was built a suburban development built by 3 Jewish land developers.
Like with everything around here, it's like you say a name and it's like, I know a film about that. I can't place it, but
and it's a really sharp. I mean, as in every suburban development, there's a utopian story to it, which has to be questioned about racial politics, because all of them had, written into the deeds of it, you couldn't sell your place to a black person.
Right.
That happened. It was challenged in the law course by 48, but it was still widespread developed. And it's Lakewood.
So like you can use like in informal ways rather than
well, individuated. You know, like rather than having a kind of city policy
but like
with black people. You have to take personal moral responsibility for not selling your house to a black person.
Right. No, exactly. It's an informal social pressure.
And that it kind of killed. There's huge, really fascinating moments of utopian housing association initiatives that come into California in the late 1940s, and they're all killed basically by this legislation, which it's challenged in 48 and it's proved to be illegal, but by that point it's become so insidious. McCarthyism comes in as well, so you have this kind of these socially progressive movements to collective housing and to mutual housing associations, so pretty much killed by this legislation, McCarthyism, by the mid-50s. And you have instead things like Lakewood, which is a very positive working class housing. They're all working in the aviation, they're all working for like the defense industry, building airplanes. But there's huge amounts of work in a kind of corridor that goes from Long Beach all the way inland. And you go there, and it's really interesting that this guy DJ Waldy he's written a history of the place, but he can't drive because his eyesight is so bad, and he has to get transit everywhere.
How does he DJ then?
Like all other DJs,
he's
just press a button on a playlist.
Yeah, he is the most DJ Waldy.
Yeah. DJ Waldy, represent.
Doll Waldy. He's the most un-DJ DJ ever.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, just this conservative, but not a kind of like that Blue Labour kind of Joel Kotkin position of like.
We've been thinking a little bit about this, like culturally conservative radical critics. How
It's good
there
to
are
explore
a lot of
them.
interesting. There are a lot of interesting
Voices.
Yeah, so
That's particularly of California, because it has it does have a particular place in like world culture.
well,
And it's a leading one.
no, so the thing about
Those
conser-
voices are lost on the international
So I mean,
stage, though.
if I'm saying like conservative, radical, politically radical, but culturally conservative critics. So I'm thinking obviously like people like Christopher Lasch, thinking of Daniel Bell, thinking of Alistair McIntyre, you know, who like goes between Catholicism and Marxism.
There's obviously all the communitarians.
Yeah, and you know,
Blue
I'm very
Labour.
sympathetic to them. Like even when I disagree, I'm like, yeah, but that's quite interesting. Like I need to take that on board. Like Daniel Bell's like cultural contradictions of capitalism. Like right at the outset, he defines himself as as an economic socialist, a political liberal, and a cultural conservative, right? And it's interesting because like just to not talk about those intellectuals, but what is socially majoritarian in Britain today, or indeed in Brazil, or indeed in the United States, right? Most likely, I would like hypothesize that majoritarian is, or at least this is a plurality of the population would fall into this, if not an outright majority, is in favor of social democratic policies in terms of a decent welfare state which makes sure that no one falls through the cracks. It's a solid and relatively high welfare net. More important than that, even high wages, a degree of public services and an investment in infrastructure which takes society forward and builds a new world, and you know, just that basic kind of modernist attitude towards the built environment, which would be progressive and in favor of state action to do that. If only the state would do that. In fact, probably that's most people's complaint. If only the state would do that, you know? Like, if only the state would actually fucking build stuff instead of, you know, being corrupt and pocketing the money or whatever. That, and would be culturally conservative in the sense of, I'm fine with gay people, but I'm not in favor of the weakening of the bounds of gender, right? So I'm not in favor of everyone being trans and blah, 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 blah. But I'm tolerant of different expressions of people can live their lives however the fuck they want, but I don't want it in my face. You know, that kind of expression, agree with it or not, that tends to be, I mean, and also just a general resistance to any of the radical liberal, culturally elite ideas of how one should live one's life, and the idea that culture, even like cultural products, cinema or whatever, should all be about positive messaging around liberal ideals, right? People hate that shit, right? Yeah. And that's probably more or less culturally majoritarian, politically majoritarian in most places. And it has no political representation, because what has political representation? You either have liberalism, cultural liberalism and economic liberalism, which you reject, or you have or you have socialists, maybe, but who are also culturally liberal, I guess,
or culturally progressive,
or you have proper conservatives, but who because they need their elite backers, defend economic liberalism and the power of established economic interests. So actually, there's very few people speaking up for that. I'm not like necessarily advocating that favor. Like I'm not blue labor. I'm not like I find that too culturally conservative. It's often too nationalist and whatever. But it is a majority which does not have actual expression. And where does that have expression? It has expression through populists. So, you know, when Marine Le Pen, just to give an example, it says, we defend the welfare state when the left actually doesn't do a good job of it, but we don't like Islamists and whatever. That speaks to people. And I think, you know, the problem is that has to really be combated, because I don't think people are like happy necessarily with her racism. Yeah. But the point is that because no one else is speaking for that kind of idea that you want to defend social democracy, but the left is unable to do that, or the left prioritizes its cultural struggle over social democracy, that it's like, well, fucking no one's speaking for us. And I think that's...
Well, to bring it back to here, the weird thing is that in this part of the world, you do have advocates for that in city government.
That's interesting.
The city governments, I mean, it seems insane that someone says Lakewood is a city, Culver City is a city. You're like, you literally have your own police force?
Right.
What the fuck? You're like, You're like, I can walk across you. Not that I would, because I'm in California. And
I could walk across you. You're nothing.
I'd probably get run over because
Right.
there's no sidewalks.
They would honk at you like a homeless person because you walk. Where's your car? You loser in life. You know.
But I guess what's the comparison? Because my understanding in the UK at least is that to become a city, you have to fulfil various conditions. And
There's no comparison.
So the reason that I know this is because Reading has applied twice to become a city and has failed both times because there's no reason to make it.
This is how Lakewood became a city. Do you want to know how Lakewood became? 1948, 3 Jewish guys bought a massive tract of farmland 30 miles from Los Angeles. Kind of played the new kind of GI bill for real homes for heroes kind of moment, where California becomes an actual the state that it is today. Everything goes back to 1947 in California. Literally, it's kind of not. You have these kind of there's probably some kind of early 20th century historian of California who goes, no, lots of really interesting things happened in California.
Yeah. But it's a dividends of like the post-war period,
we all, if we all kind of like in the UK look back to 47 as an epochal moment, it's nothing compared to California. Literally, you have a whole switch of focus with the theatre of war towards the Pacific taking place, building up of kind of huge military installations up and down the west coast.
So it's the golden years of like 45 to 73 make the golden state.
Yeah, the manifest destiny.
I like
actually,
that. Good.
Yeah, very good. Manifest destiny actually happens. It's like there's this kind of like.
But a century later, but
this idea that it was all going to happen, and it finally happens, and it happens through an act of massive, one of the most huge military conflagrations that history's ever fucking known. It's an incredibly traumatic experience, but it creates this huge employment and defense.
Which is the story of the United States as a whole after the Second World War. I mean, the Second World War is both world wars are very, very good for the United States. Its involvement is relatively limited.
No one had a better war than California.
We were then interrupted by our server, who proceeded to give us an impromptu sociological overview of the Golden State, which actually proved kind of useful.
Food was enough. You guys want any other thing to snack on?
I'm super hungry.
No, you know what? We might just leave it for this now.
No otherwise, it's snooze time by 3. Isn't it?
On your way back up to LA, you might fall asleep.
When are you going to come up with these autonomous vehicles so we can do that?
Oh, no,
you guys working on it?
Oh yeah. That's a little farther north, but
well, when they can come and test it out here. Yeah?
You drive around here, you see plenty of Teslas. You see plenty of people who have those out here.
Really?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so a lot of the wealth is here in Silicon Valley. It's very interesting, like here, because California is mostly like a blue state with a lot of that kind of population, but the red part is very much concentrated here in Orange County and up north in like Silicon Valley area. Like a lot of the business and the wealth is.
Red, which color?
Is like Republican.
Red's Republican, it's the opposite.
Are they two different sorts of Republicans? Because I'd imagine this is more the old money, socially conservative.
A little bit,
Silicon Valley is more of the libertarian.
There is, but a lot of like the wealth up there is also some older wealth of people who just they put their money into startup companies and they don't really. That's why you see a whole bunch of startup companies that come and go because they have so much. They just throw it in there like, okay, I'm gonna diversify in all these like startups, and then so some of them sink and some of them float. And
the kind of VC venture capital.
Yeah, exactly. The capitalists are up there.
Yeah. I was following like a Twitter, I don't know if it was a Twitter or Facebook kind of thread. It was someone's like, if you had to visit one US state which would give you the best impression of the whole country, what would it be? And like, people have come out with all sorts of shouts, whatever, about actually Pennsylvania, whatever. Actually, Pennsylvania was quite a frequent occurrence because they could say, well, you got Philadelphia, which is like New York, but then you have like Pittsburgh, which is Rust Belt and whatever. and then you got some countryside in the middle, and you go whatever. But actually, lots of people were saying California because despite California's
It's huge. Like,
particularities, like you've got the Central Valley, you've got like a kind of very
it's big.
Yeah.
There's a lot of population. We're politics-wise, like on this last ballot of our elections last year. This has been happening for a long time, but people trying to vote to split up the state into 2 states, into actually like northern and southern California.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because you could split it east-west as well. Because the interior part is quite more conservative, right? Like
people.
The Chile of the north.
Yeah.
People have been.
Fucking Chile could be split up, man. Like that's too long.
People hate it. Like people hate it, or they're like for it. But we
Wow.
voted this year to vote to get rid of daylight savings time, and to have like control over it, to like move it wherever we want. And it's like some people who are like, okay, well, if we change it, like our kids in LA are gonna be like walking home in the dark, or like going to school in the morning in the dark, like not very safe conditions, you know.
So you now have the. Do you want
rush hour is gonna be no, because then rush hour is gonna be even worse. But people are already terrible fucking drivers. Like the traffic is absolutely trash. It's garbage.
And the politics of daylight savings time, it's spicy. Like it's an actual spicy topic.
It's a
people
very
get
weird
really angry
topic
about
that
this
people-
shit.
it really
I live
is.
in Brazil, and they've just decided to get rid of like summertime. Not get rid of summertime.
We're
Summer's still gonna happen. Summer's
during
still
summer,
gonna happen.
we're putting
But
up
they've
a
gotten rid of
dome.
like the time, like daylight savings time for summertime, whatever it's called. And people are like fucking outraged by this because it means that like the sun's gonna set, or instead of having long summer evenings, you're gonna like the sun's gonna finish at 7 in the evening, and people get really pissed off about this. But I don't know if there's a political positioning on this, or if it's just like your own personal
I think
preference.
it's just like I don't know if there's politically if there's like a motivation behind it. It's just
but the vote was on whether you controlled it.
whether we basically whether it was up to our Congress to decide when it was.
So did they win the vote to control when it was?
Yes and no. Like it's still kind of being processed.
Right.
Because even if it fully goes through, then it's still going to take time for them to vote on it in Congress. So it's still they're still kind of debating about it.
A lot of the relationship between the kind of state Congress and the federal government is like who gets to control what, rather than what they actually control.
Yeah, that's something that the state government could control. But even within the state government, then all of our everybody, they also have to be like, okay, now we have to figure out when we want to move it to, if we even want to move it.
It's like we want the principle of being able to choose.
Yes, oh god, by district, that would be terrible. That would be
Democratic control of time.
Yeah.
What time is it?
They're just like, fuck it, we're on Hawaii
our own
time. Fuck
zone,
you guys.
California time zone. That would be absolute garbage.
I vote for it to be an hour ago.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Whenever
yeah.
I get to
That's a
work,
conservative
that is
position.
when I'm on time. That's when it starts.
The question of suburbs is inextricable from the model of Californian development, traditionally seen by progressive critics as sites of conformity and quiescence. Some now argue that this relationship has almost flipped around. Suburbs are diverse and even possibly sites of rebellion, while it's the inner cities that have become homogenous and even exclusionary. Back to Joel Kotkin.
The idea that the suburbs, and by the way, it's not just true here, are these sort of boring places. Actually, what's weird is the inner city has become boring.
Right, that absolutely. I mean, now I think you could maybe maintain an argument 20 years ago for saying the inner city was interesting, it was diverse, and the suburbs were boring. And you say, well, even if you don't buy the argument that the suburbs are boring, now you can at least, you can definitely say that the inner city has become increasingly...
I mean, as an old New Yorker, early memories of walking with my grandmother, and she would walk through Greenwich Village and say, oh yeah, the Gershwins lived in this building, and I got arrested at a Margaret Sanger rally at this corner, and if you were Jewish and you were on the Ukrainian bloc, you got crap kicked out of you. I mean, in other words, there was, and I can still remember, or take San Francisco, there were still ethnic neighborhoods in San Francisco. Yeah. There's nothing. It's poor people, hipsters, and rich people.
So maybe talk about, George, I think wanted to ask about, the built environment and places of rebellion maybe.
Yeah, so suburbs more diverse, less atomized than are often in a crude way constructed. But what do you think of the possibilities for suburban rebellion, I guess? Because we've seen obviously the Gilets jaunes in...
Great question.
Is this coming to California anytime soon?
Well, you know, we're publishing a new geography of peace precisely on the British election, where we think that a lot of the changes, you know, the Brexit party is probably going to win the election. You know, will be the largest player. And I think of this, the Gilets Jaunes, you know, which is portrayed as a bunch of, you know, rustic, you know, people like, you know, sort of like the, you know, like the, you know, people in the Gironde during
les boeufs, as they're derogatorily referred to as in France,
But actually, it's predominantly the suburbanites. And I am hoping that the suburbs will rebel. I mean, you know, at what point will people who spent their life to buy a house and all of a sudden the state says, oh, by the way, they can build a fourplex next to you, and you know, you have to pay half your income in taxes, and you have to, you know, you can't have a pool, or you can't use a gas generator even though the power keeps going out. I'm hoping that there'll be a rebellion. The problem is a communications issue, I think, in a large. The suburbs have no voice. The media is controlled completely from the inner city, mostly controlled by the oligarchs. There's no voice for the middle class. I mean, it's really interesting. All the big newspapers support densification, and the city councils are all against it, because the city council person has to run for office. And if you live in the San Fernando Valley and they say, well, we're going to double the density, you'll say, why? I don't want this. And of course, the great irony is it's happening at a time when California is not growing in population, and LA actually lost population last year. And so I think that it's this is a national issue. Suburbs have no voice. There's nobody speaking for them. You know, the rural areas have their voice, and the cities, you know, the inner cities have their voice. And even the neighborhoods inside the cities have very little power.
What would you class the suburbs? I mean, I don't want to say that you should ventriloquize the suburbs, but what would you say that the suburbs' voice should be, or what do you see as the suburbs' interest? I mean, as a maybe not as a class, because the suburbs isn't really a class, but as a place. I mean, what is its interest?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you got to look at, okay, what are the things that are important in terms of middle class families? I mean, housing prices, price of energy, price of water. The assurance that if I move into something that's a single family neighborhood, that it's going to pretty much stay that way. Now, there may be some density on the major streets, and that, you know, and I think people should have to accommodate that. But you simply have to say, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for the day-to-day life of a person who is middle class? Quality of the schools is a huge issue. To me, you know, you mentioned conservative, you know, and I've been, you know, believe me, if I would identify myself as a conservative, my life would have been much easier than it turned out to be. But I'm not. I'm an old social democrat. And I feel that social democrats should be in favor of good public schools, and we should be in favor of upward mobility and a diverse economy. That, you know, one of the great tragedies that's taken place under this current regime is let's say you're a business in Orange County or LA County or San Francisco, and it's just too expensive for you to be there. Historically, you moved into the suburbs, you moved further east, you moved to the Central Valley, you moved to Livermore, you moved to Riverside, you moved to Yorba Linda, whatever it is, you moved out. Now that's almost impossible. And what economic development people tell me is they just say, I'm not going to deal with the crazies in Sacramento. If I've got to expand, I'm going to expand in Nevada. I'm going to expand in. So the California dream, in a way, is being exported to other states. Now, they can't recreate the climate. They can't recreate the topography. But they can recreate something of the life that Californians enjoyed en masse at one point. And look, why would anyone move to Dallas from California if they didn't have to?
Drive by on Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe to try to round this out and pin some of the elements that we've spoken about to some bigger ideas, or kind of at a level of abstraction, I guess. Does this middle class squeeze the kind of, perhaps the spectre even of uselessness? I mean, the idea that many new industries just aren't mopping up unemployment in the way that they used to, or that their expansion doesn't bring in new employment. The role of what you call the new clerisy, I mean, the ideological functions played by the media, the academia, to a certain extent, the government. Is this the end of Americanism, or the American dream of California? And then I guess as a follow-on to that, what would you see as if you describe yourself as an old social democrat, a collective political response to that?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, the good thing is California does not prevent the American dream from taking place. At least it hasn't yet. You know, if we end up with a government that follows California's model, then we may see that. But I think that the real issue is fundamentally the people who run the state don't give a damn what happens to the middle class. They'll talk about it, but they really don't give a damn. They don't understand that the average middle class family wants a single family house with a backyard. That's what they want. Every poll, every survey, every 80% of what they buy, that's what they want. You've got a government that now thinks it knows better. It's a kind of, this is what the clerisy is all about. We know better. You have to sacrifice to save the planet. Well, meanwhile, I'm going to take my private jet. It was a perfect little story. I was speaking at a Wall Street Journal conference on the environment, and it was in Santa Barbara. And I asked the organizer, I said, well, where are all these people from? Oh, they're from Silicon Valley. And how did they get here? They took their private jets. But they're going to tell everybody else, well, you know what? You can't drive that F-150. That's bad for the planet. How about your goddamn private jet?
Well, and I guess another angle to this as well, in terms of we know best, is something that we've spent the past kind of couple of days discussing, which is kind of notions of wellness, where the cultural and political and economic elite are very focused on their own wellness, which is a level of health beyond health, right? Which brings in all sorts of quasi-spiritual notions of wellness, but of course there's no, just basic healthcare isn't available for the majority. So
a very strong moral critique as well, and I think it's the same with environmentalism. Oh, well, you don't care about the planet, you're a bad person, you can't take care of yourself and have good physical mental health.
How dare you eat a hamburger?
Yeah,
right.
And of course what's really funny about it is these same people who are imposing these things, many of them obviously indulge themselves in ways that we can't even imagine. And also they have no sense of even what the impact is. What's funny about California is we've had all these crazy regulations, and our reduction of GHG is 40th out of the 50 states. In other words, because many of the things that they're actually proposing make things worse, because they say, well, we're going to have high density, and we're not going to fix the roads. Guess what you get? You get unbelievable congestion and terrible pollution from the congestion. There seems that in the last few years we've taken social justice out as an economic factor and made it into a lifestyle issue. There's a lawsuit. Are you going up to San Francisco?
We're not.
Okay. My friend Jennifer Hernandez has a lawsuit, with 200 civil rights leaders in California saying how California's climate policies are discriminatory against minorities and the poor, and I can get you the link to that, cannot get any reporting. People who, if they were complaining about race, they would be on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. They can't get arrested because the holy grail is anything that the climate lobby says has got to be right.
Yeah. And
of course, climate lobby is increasingly not about fixing anything or making life better. It's about we call virtue signaling.
Yeah.
It's about how noble, like Apple.
And without a popular buy-in, actually, the ideas necessary and the sort of programs and transformations of the economy necessary to actually perhaps deal with to decarbonize the economy in the future and so on won't be possible, because many of those ideas seem to be premised on behavior management and basically telling people what to do, and people generally take exception to that.
Well, and I think that's and also when your program means my quality of life is going to decline.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I try to when I talk to the Greens, I say, You got to give people a vision of how life can be better. You know, yes, you can have a single family house, but you can do like we've done now with 2 houses. You can drought resist your yard. You can take certain steps to make that work. You can work at home. You can do many things that improve the quality of life and the environment. But you've got to do it in the context of how people actually want to live. But that what you have instead is you have a class of people who are, in some cases, very wealthy, and in other cases, don't have children, are 28 years old, and the sort of AOCs of the world. The kind of this belief that if you don't believe what I believe, you're destroying the planet. How medieval is that worldview?
So maybe because you mentioned her, and it might be worth to finish on the question of what you think of these ideas of Green New Deal, whether you buy into some notion of that, and how maybe that relates to the Californian dream. I mean, for me at least, it seems conceivable that one could have both, that one could have a more decarbonized system with greater public transport, but as well as build out of housing and of public services necessary to give people a higher standard of living.
Well,
do you think they're contradictory?
I think they're contradictory in the world called reality. If you're going to have super high energy prices, you're not going to have any industry. Industry is not going to come here. I mean, you look at the semiconductor industry, essentially a California developed industry. Almost all the new semiconductor plants are in other states or other countries. Those produce, I've been to plants in Utah run by Intel with thousands of really good jobs, middle-class jobs, but they're in Utah. The other thing, now, where I give her credit is she does at least deal with the class ramifications. The problem is, do you think the board of the Sierra Club would like those taxes? I doubt it.
That's an alliance which maybe needs to be broken, but
well, I mean, there is that contradiction. The other thing is, some of her ideas are just insane. Like, we're going to get rid of planes and we're going to do high-speed rail. We can't even make high-speed rail work here, and the United States is just too big a country. I mean, even at decent speeds, it would take 15 hours to get from here to Chicago, in the most optimal system. And, if you can fly there in 3 hours, you're going to take a train for 15. I doubt it. You're going to wipe out the aerospace industry completely. You're going to get rid of the fossil fuel industry, one of the highest paid, middle class, unionized industries in this country. So there are lots of contradictions. And I think what's missing is a sense of sort of starting off by saying the purpose of a society is to make life better for the people who live in that society. And we've completely lost that. It's all about virtue signaling and sort of these utopian visions that end up with dystopian results. And if you don't believe that, I suggest you go to downtown Los Angeles and see the towers that have been built that are owned almost exclusively by foreigners who are just buying what a friend of mine calls vertical safe deposit boxes, and all the homeless. If homelessness is not a sign that something's wrong, I don't know what is.
Your kids will meditate in school. Your kids will meditate in school. California, Uber Alice.
Alright, that's it for part 3 of CaliBunga, Tech, Drugs, and Capitalist Soul. If you like what you've heard, consider signing up to our Patreon at patreon.com/bungacast. This will give you access to the paywalled parts of this series, as well as all of our regular subscriber-only shows. If you're not in a position to do that, do give the podcast a review on our Facebook page or on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. We are at BungaCast everywhere you may find us on the internet. We're back in a week with more CaliBunga, exploring European encounters with California, more on Silicon Valley ideology and the rationalization of social life. Catch you then. Bye-bye.
Wear that happy face. Close your eyes, can't happen here. Big bro on his white horse is near. Oh, the hippies won't come back, you say? Mellow out, Jack, or you will pay. Mellow out, or you will pay. California, Uber Alice. California, Uber Alice. Uber Alice. California, Uber Alice. California. Oh, 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 oh.